We are going to get started here in just a couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes or so. So if you can hear and see me, go ahead and grab a glass of water, get a pen and paper ready, get situated. We're going to start here in just a couple minutes. All right, everyone, let's go ahead and dive in here. Welcome. I'm happy that you guys are logging in because we're going to talk about something that a lot of people in dentistry just don't really talk about and teach how to do. How do we analyze the financials of a practice that we are considering purchasing so that we know, is this practice worth purchasing? Is this a good deal? Is this a bad deal? How am I going to be impacted personally? What's my income going to be after I purchase this thing? Like, how should I think about buying this practice? Is it distressed? Is it healthy? What's going on here? So I hope that this webinar, this kind of convenient way for all of us to kind of come together tonight, gives you some food for thought, has you kind of think of things in a new way that maybe you didn't think about before this webinar. So let me dive in here very briefly, because every time I have a webinar, there are people that log in that have maybe never met me or heard of me before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on me at all, but you do need to understand who is talking to you. My name's Scott Leune, and I have started practices from scratch and sold them. I've acquired a bunch of practices, sold them. I've helped start more than 200 practices over my career. And I've also built other companies that have had over 20,000 dental practices across the US and Canada use my companies to help run aspects of those dental practices. And so I'm coming to you from a lot of like in the trenches experiences in just the nitty gritty details of running highly profitable practices, whether those are startups or whether those are acquisitions. I started my career as a dentist, but I went through some medical ups and downs that pulled me out of the dental chair and pushed me into the entrepreneurial side of dentistry. And since then, I've basically made it my career's passion, my focus, like what I stand for in my career. I've made it to master the business side of dentistry. And so I teach a lot of courses and I do coaching on different aspects of the business side, from startups and acquisitions all the way to multiple locations, and even just the location you have right now. How can you make that location throw off over $1 million take home pay or more per year? That is what I've specialized in. It's what I focused on. All right. So today we are going to talk about acquisitions. So let's have kind of an open kind of thought process with this. And by the way, as I'm speaking about this, you may have questions. please feel free to type in your questions into the chat area. And when I'm done, if I have time, I will do my very best to kind of go through those questions and answer as many of them as possible. Please type them in as soon as you think of one, so that you don't forget. You don't forget what you were going to ask. And then we will be able to go through that at the end. All right. So acquisitions. There are, even though I'm kind of known as maybe the startup guy, since I've just done so many hundreds of startups I've been a part of, I've also been part of a lot of acquisitions. And when I think about kind of that debate, startup or acquisition debate, I think we lose touch with what we should really be doing. We should not be asking ourselves, should I do a startup or should I acquire a practice? We should be looking at our area and saying, what's the best opportunity out there for me? It might be a startup or an acquisition. We need to consider both. That means that we need to have some sort of training and knowledge base as a future owner so that we can analyze the area for both. We can pull the startup demographics and analysis and understand what level of opportunity there is in the startup side. And we can pull the practices that are for sale, pull their financials, their metrics, and analyze those as a potential acquirer. And we can stand back and say, okay, which one of these is the biggest opportunity for me in this area at this moment in time? In general, though, there are some kind of rules of thumb. Acquisitions are typically straightforward to fund compared to a startup, although startups are also straightforward, but the acquisitions are sometimes easier to fund because you are buying a business that is already existing, throwing off cash. And you guys know that. But think a little deeper now. You know, it might be easier to buy an existing business as opposed to fund a business that has no customers, right? No patients. But what does that mean? You might be on this webinar because you want to have lots of locations, maybe. You want to own maybe multiple, 5, 10, who knows, maybe even more than that. So as you think about your strategy and your model, understand that if you can do some acquisitions, those are easier to fund. That your growth rate, your expansion rate could be faster because the banks will give you money more easily. If you had in your mind to only do startups as you build your group of practices, understand that you might run into kind of some limits there, and it can take longer for those startup practices to sort of cook and get well done and be worth a lot of money before the banks will give you more money for more startups. That is why so often entrepreneurial dentists building multiple locations, they're doing a blend of the two. Their kind of vision is a startup vision, but they're constantly looking for a practice that is worth acquiring financially speaking. Oh, that's actually something important I said. A practice worth acquiring financially speaking. This webinar is about the financial realities of the acquisition, not the emotional reactions we have to looking at a practice that's for sale. I can fix an ugly practice and make it pretty. But what is harder to do is take a practice that's failing financially and make that a home run financially. We are going to be very logical in this webinar and focus heavily on how do I analyze the numbers, the profit and loss statement specifically, so that I know, how healthy financially this business opportunity is. Understanding that the other things that might make me feel good might be distractions. How new the equipment is might be a distraction if it's not super new, or how pretty the office is or isn't might be a distraction. Let's not let the lipstick make us think the pig is pretty. All right. So we need to really understand what's going on at the foundation of this transaction. And so I'm going to be looking at the financials with you. We're going to be talking about, okay, well, how much cash flow would we get if we own this potential practice? And of course, we need to consider things like what you see on the slide, facility improvements and staffing. Of course, when we buy a practice, we are going to create a budget for the initial improvements we need to make to it so that we'll get a practice loan to buy the practice, but we may also get extra money from that practice loan to make some of the improvements we need to make initially. Of course, we're going to look at who's working there, how many people are doing what, and what our cost is. Those are all logical things to look at. But what's driving most of the decision around buying a practice is going to be the financial performance and our ability to predict where that might end up after it's in our hands. I hope that makes sense. So when I think about these acquisitions, I'd like to put them into two categories for a second, because our behavior should be different depending on the category we're in. So we can have a healthy business that we acquire. We can have a distressed business. Healthy business is one that I'm defining as healthy purely based on the financial performance. Does it make money at a successful rate? Okay. If it is making money, if it is healthy financially, my initial goal after I buy it is to not lose the profit it was making before me. My initial goal of acquiring that after acquiring that practice is to protect what we call the EBITDA. That is an accounting term that defines basically the financial performance of the practice, how profitable it is in a way, how much money it creates. I need to protect that. So I need to protect the EBITDA. Whereas in a distress acquisition, it might be a decent opportunity, but man, the practice isn't making money. It's not actually projecting to make good money. It is broken financially. It's distressed. My goal in that situation is, as fast as possible, I heavily disrupt that practice because I must force it into financial success. So what do these mean, right? Protecting the EBITDA versus heavy disruption. Here's an example. A healthy acquisition. I buy it and it's performing well before I buy it. It looks good. It's going to be profitable after I own it. Like, it's a great practice to buy financially speaking. So I buy it. Then what? In this first phase of buying it, even if we're overstaffed, I'm not going to lay someone off. Even if I've got a front office person that is not doing a good job, I may not address that yet. Even though we don't have the software I like, I'm not going to change it. Even though they've been scheduling in a way that I really don't like that much, I'm not going to alter that. I am going to get into this practice and try to mimic the financial performance of the last owner. I'm going to use that vehicle, this practice, those systems, that software, that team, that way. I'm going to jump into that car and I'm going to try to drive as far as the practice was driving before me, because that was the whole reason why I bought this under these terms, was to repeat that financial performance. So in this first phase, I'm going to kind of put all my desires on a shelf for a second, let them sit there. And in this first phase, I am going to operate this practice within kind of the rules and policies that it had, and understand, therefore, and during that time, what's actually creating the success. That front office person, I think, that might not be doing a good job might actually be one of the reasons why we're so successful. I wouldn't know that until I was in that practice for a while. So that is kind of the take-home message for now. In a healthy practice, financially speaking, healthy, we're going to go in, and in that first phase, first 3 to 6 months, we are going to do very little changes. We are just going to try to mimic, try to copy the financial performance that they had before us, all the while gaining the experience of understanding what's going on, what's actually driving this thing. We're making notes about what we will change eventually. And then, by the way, when it does come time to start changing, we must go low disruption changes, because again, the goal is to protect the EBITDA we bought. So if I don't like the software, I'm not going to change that as the first thing I change. That's highly disruptive. I don't like the way they schedule. I might tweak that, but I'm not going to turn that upside down and inside out. That's highly disruptive. But one change might be, let's order supplies from this company instead of that company. That's low disruption. Let's hire someone to answer the phones when we miss the call. That's low disruption, right? Let's change our credit card processing to something more affordable. So that is my strategy with the healthy acquisition. Go down to the distressed acquisition, and you can already tell me what I'm going to say. In that distressed acquisition, heavy disruption means we are going to change very quickly. This is a practice that if I don't change, it will not make money. I went into it knowing that. I bought this thing because I saw opportunities if I changed it, right? So I must disrupt it. So often in phase one of disruption is cutting costs aggressively. A practice you purchase that is not very profitable, almost always a big component of their issues have to do with overspending. So we are going to potentially make changes to the software. We're going to make changes to how we spend our money. We might not even hire everyone back after the acquisition. Shoot, we might end up with a whole new team within the first couple months, which is okay. The old team was failing. The old setup needs to be thrown away. We must take the Lego pieces of this practice and put it together in a better way so it makes money. So we're going to aggressively and thoughtfully cut costs in the very beginning. We are going to also aggressively spend money on marketing potentially. Be very focused on the things that raise patient flow. We are going to be very focused on the operational systems of the practice, the tasks people have and the words people say that create diagnosis and create case acceptance and create collections. We're going to maybe ignore the fact that, the wall's scuffed up and that, this assistant chair needs to be replaced at some point. And we're going to ignore issues like that in the beginning. We are just going to make massive changes so that the financial performance of this practice will improve. And this will be something that makes money. And here's the problem. We're about to dive into the numbers so we can understand how to analyze them. But here's the problem. Most practices that are for sale today that you see to a private dentist, a private dentist looks at them, those are distressed acquisitions. Most of the practices I see today would fall in that category. The problem with that is that most dentists looking to buy a practice do not have experience in turning practices around. They maybe have never even owned a practice. Could you imagine buying a failing restaurant as the first restaurant you've ever even run with the mandatory requirement that you turn the restaurant around and make it profitable? That's not an easy thing. So, when we buy a distressed practice, it's very high risk. We may not fail, meaning we may not go bankrupt or anything like that. The risk really is that we'll spend the next 3 to 5 years or more just working hard and not making much money. That's the failure I'm talking about. Should we buy a distressed practice or should we just start one? Our average startup goes to $2 million collections, almost $1 million take-home pay by year 3. In a beautiful location with brand new equipment, software you chose, and employees that you hired. Why would we buy a distressed practice, especially if we don't specialize in turning them around, if there might be a startup opportunity out there? So usually I see people buy distressed practices just because they haven't gotten the training in startups. They don't understand what that opportunity actually is. They think startups are high risk. I think a distressed acquisition is high risk, not a startup. So, but if you're going to do a distressed acquisition, you can be very successful with it. It's just much more difficult. And I don't know if I should bet on you or if you should bet on you doing something really difficult that you've never done before, especially if you haven't even gone through any sort of business training to do it. So understand that if you go down that path, you're going to have to go through business training. You are going to have to really invest in yourself so that you're worth betting on. And this distressed acquisition will never quite look like a failure. But the way I would view it as a failure is if you are not becoming wealthy after buying it. So you have to become wealthy. All right. So now let's dive into some numbers. How would we know, is this distressed? What's going on? Here's a problem. You're going to get some sort of profit and loss statement from the person selling the practice or the broker. Never probably is it going to look this nice, this organized in different categories with percentages, accurately represented to you, it's probably going to be a little bit of a mess. So what I'm showing you for teaching purposes is a proper profit and loss statement. But I have to put this little disclaimer at the bottom right now that says, like, you may not find a proper profit and loss statement from the seller. It might be very vague, and it may or may not even be very accurate. So, one kind of requirement in analyzing an acquisition is to go get your accountant to review their profit and loss statement and try to point out the red flags of why this thing may or may not even be accurate. But I need to teach you how to analyze it. So let's assume that you are getting a decent profit and loss statement eventually, and that it is relatively detailed and relatively accurate. Here's an example where we've got a practice that is collecting $1.18 million, and the seller wants $850,000. Is it worth it? Well, is it worth it? You might, if I were to ask you to tell me, is that the right price? You might pull out your calculator right now, right? And you might divide 850,000 by 1.18 million, and you'll see that it's 72% of collections. And you might say, yeah, that's a fair price. Well, let me just break the bubble now. For those of you that don't know, a price should not be a percentage of your collections. To you, a fair price should be based on the EBITDA of the practice multiplied by a proper number or multiple or ratio. I'm going to explain to you what that means. But in layman's terms, dental practices might be worth around 4.5 to 5.5 times their financial success. What we call that in the accounting world or in the business world, financial success, we'll say that's represented by EBITDA or sometimes net income. And that 4.5 to 5.5 times is represented by a multiple. We call that a multiple. So a practice is worth, let's just call it for easy math, 5 times its EBITDA or net income, 5 times how financially successful it is. Okay. Well, you really need to understand though how to calculate EBITDA and how to know what it actually is in your hands. Because the EBITDA I'm showing you right now, or the net income I'm showing you right now, is not accurate because that is the seller's P&L that we haven't fixed yet. What we're going to do is we're going to fix this P&L pretending like we own it now. What would this P&L look like if we own it? That's called a pro forma. We are going to pro forma this P&L to see what the financial performance would be like after we might own it. So here's the first set of changes that we find. When we look at this, we see, and I realize some of you may not be able to read this on your phone, and don't worry, I'm going to say it out loud. But the first thing we see is that, this seller did not have a high enough cost for health insurance. They didn't offer as many benefits as what we intend to offer. So in this example, after we buy it, we're going to actually spend more on employee benefits than what the seller was. So we're going to have to kind of adjust this P&L. We're going to have to add $5,000 of costs so we get more in line with the benefits we intend to provide. So our employee benefits aren't going to be $6,000 as shown by the seller. We're going to add $5,000 to it. And now they're going to be $11,000. So that hurts, in essence, our EBITDA, right? Because we have a higher expense. But on the flip side, when we look at other things here, we find that, or this is another thing that we always see, we find that the seller was paying themselves $120,000 salary. That is not a reasonable salary. Not to calculate EBITDA, if I had to pay an associate dentist, let's just call it 30% of their production, just making something up, 30% of their production, then I'd have to pay them a lot more than 120 grand to do the dentistry in this practice. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend like after we buy it, we're going to put an associate in there because that helps us calculate the final EBITDA number. Even though we might be that associate ourselves, we might be that dentist ourselves, we need to calculate a proper cost of us on this journey to understand what the EBITDA will be and what the practice value should be. And so what we see here is the seller was underpaying themselves. If I had to hire an associate, I'd have to pay the associate $265,000. The seller only paid themselves $120,000 on this P&L. So I'm going to have to add more cost, not just salary cost, but also payroll cost. But I'm going to subtract some insurance costs that the seller was paying that I'm not going to have to pay. And so the net effect of that is I've corrected the dentist compensation now. On the pro forma, I've now corrected the seller underpaying themselves on paper to what a dentist should be paid on paper. I hope that makes sense. As we continue down this profit and loss statement, the next thing we see is that the seller has lab fees and supply fees that are unreasonably high. And we believe that after we buy the practice and implement a budget, we will be able to bring the supply costs to 4% of collections and the lab costs to 6% of collections. So what we're going to do is we are going to adjust the costs down. The seller overspent. We're not going to overspend. So when we kind of pro forma this out and act like we now own the practice, we are going to give a little credit back, money back, saying, hey, we're not going to spend as much as the seller, so we're going to see that as profit. We're going to see that as EBITDA. So we adjusted it, on the lab side, 16,000, and we adjusted back almost 28,000 on the supply side. And if we continue, we made no adjustments on the facility. And then in the final category, we also made additional adjustments. We see that the seller was overspending on marketing. We've got our own marketing company that we use in our other location. Maybe we know with dentalmarketing.com, that's the company that I use, that we spend less per month than what the seller was doing. So we are going to add back costs. We're going to spend less than the seller. Also, we're not going to keep paying for the seller's car after we own the practice. So we're going to add the car costs back. We are also not going to pay merchant fees anymore. We're going to implement a patient pay system. We're going to add that 18,000 back. We're not going to keep putting money to the seller's charity after we own the practice. So we're going to add that back. And we're not going to pay for their travel. And we are not going to pay as much for accounting as the seller was doing. So what are we doing here? We are now creating this complete list of adjustments. Money we have to add back to profit or to EBITDA, money we have to take away from EBITDA. And so what I'm saying is after I potentially own this practice, I will have a little more staff benefits. I'll have a properly paid dentist. That dentist might be me. We're not going to overspend on labs or supplies. We're not going to have merchant fees, and I'm not going to pay for some of the seller's discretionary stuff. What does the EBITDA look like when we make all of those adjustments? That's where we're trying to get so that we then know, is this practice valued at the right number? Is the sale price make sense or not? And so as you can see, once I've made those adjustments, we have a EBITDA of 219,000. 219,000. Okay. Well, is an $850,000 sale price reasonable for $219,000 of EBITDA? That's 3.9 times EBITDA. That is a good purchase price. We know 4.5 to like 5.5 multiple is typical. We're less than that. We're at a 3.9 multiple. We're less than all that. And so this is a good purchase price in our hands because we're going to make these adjustments. This purchase price works. So how does the math then play out? We can see that, again, the EBITDA is 219,000. So for an $850,000 sale price, it's 3.9 times EBITDA. Well, we're going to take out a loan for $900,000 because maybe we're having some working capital in our loan, or maybe we want to make some minor improvements, or we need to buy a scanner or something. Often, almost always, our loan amount is going to be higher than the purchase price to pay for the additional changes we want to make in the first phase. And so we've got a loan amount. I'm just showing an example, 6.9% at 10 years. Our annual loan payments or a little over 100 grand. So our post-loan business income is 112,000, but that's not my take-home pay. How do we calculate take-home pay? It's going to be my EBITDA and my doctor's salary. And we can see here my doctor's salary I had listed at 265,000. You know, before I go to the next slide and show this to you, let me back up for a second. EBITDA tells us how successful the business is financially after we pay a dentist and after we pay all of our normal operating expenses. EBITDA, we need that number so we know is the purchase price reasonable or not. But EBITDA is not the same thing as take-home pay if we are also a working dentist. So our take-home pay is actually the EBITDA and the dentist salary or the associate pay that we allocated for ourselves. So in this example, our take-home pay, as a dentist kind of communicates, would be 219,000 of the EBITDA plus 265,000 of that associate salary. So we end up with a take-home pay of 484,000. Now, out of that 484,000, we need to make $107,000 of loan payments, and we're going to have to pay for taxes, right? So, and we're going to also have our own list of discretionary expenses. We might now pay for our kind of trip to Bahamas, and because there was a CE event there, we write it off through our company. We may make charitable donations and pay for our automobile, or those discretionary expenses are part of take-home pay. So the way we calculate take-home pay, again, is what's the EBITDA, which does not include discretionary expenses. It doesn't include taxes or depreciation or amortization, loan payments. What's the EBITDA, and what is the kind of salary we allocated to ourselves? We add that together, and that's our take-home pay. And out of that number, we pay taxes, we pay loan payments, we pay for the discretionary stuff. So this specific example is one that I would say it would be a healthy acquisition. We end up, after owning this practice, after these adjustments, we end up taking home almost $500,000 as a dentist off of a $1.17 million practice. So we're decent overhead percentages. You know what? Let me just tell you what that is. 484,000 take-home pay divided by 1.179 million means that our overhead is 59%. That's not great, but that's definitely respectable. Of course, this day and age, I see practices of way worse than that. But I'd like the overhead below 50%. Is at 59%. This is a healthy practice, financially speaking. If I buy it, not only can I make the loan payment, I've got a whole lot of money left over. So even if we hit hard times or I screw the practice up, there's enough money left over that we're not going to be in trouble. This is a healthy acquisition. Like I said earlier, with healthy acquisitions, our primary goal in the first phase is to just protect that EBITDA. No disruption, minimal changes in a healthy acquisition. We get in there, we try to continue the same financial performance that the seller had before us so that this acquisition makes sense, so that we actually did acquire 219,000 of EBITDA. You see, if we screw it up, if we go in there and disrupt things just because we want to, and our EBITDA goes down to 100 grand after we screw it up, we sure did pay a whole lot of money for a practice with only $100,000 of EBITDA. It was an $850,000 acquisition. That's an 8.5 times multiple. We can't have that happen. Our first primary goal is to protect this EBITDA, to continue this financial performance. Okay, so now let's take that same process, and now let's look at another example, another practice. And it's not important that you can read all these numbers. I'm going to print them out here or type them out for you. We've got a smaller practice now. We've got a practice collecting $672,000. Man, the seller wants 650,000 for the practice. Does that seem high to you? If you answer yes, you gave the wrong answer. The real answer is, well, it depends. We need to calculate the EBITDA first, so we know the multiple, so we know if that's a fair offer. Again, the value of the practice is not based on the collections. It is primarily based on how financially successful this practice is. So we need to calculate that success. We need to calculate the EBITDA. We need to understand the adjustments, the pro forma financials, and here are a list of potential things. Okay, let's start with what you see. So on the left, you can see category supplies, amortization, depreciation, interest, merchant fees. These are all things showing up on their profit and loss statement. And the current category are the actual numbers they have. They say they spend $95,000 a year on supplies. Okay, pro forma, that's what we're going to spend. We're not going to spend $95,000. We're going to spend $26,000. And so the difference between what they do and what we do creates that net change column. So let's go through each one of these. Supplies, they spend 12.4% of their collections on supplies. If that's accurate, that is absolutely ridiculous. And most practices honestly spend about 8 or 9%, practices that you'll find for sale. You could easily get that down to 4%. It's one of the things that we teach in our seminars. That should be 4%. By the way, supplies is dental supplies plus office supplies combined should be less than 4%. Well, let's look at theirs. They have dental supplies of $95,000, office supplies of $3,000. We are only going to spend 4% on dental supplies and office supplies combined. So our office supplies are going to read 0 because they're already in this number. So the difference between their 95 and our 26 is in our favor, $68,000. Amortization and depreciation interest. These are loan payments and depreciation of equipment. They're costs on paper, but they are not costs that operate the practice. These are things that we add back to calculate EBITDA. EBITDA, by the way, stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So EBITDA is how much money there is after you pay all of your bills, but before you pay for interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So we're going to add these numbers back to calculate our EBITDA. Merchant fees, we're going to be on a patient pay system, so we add that cost back. We talked about office supplies. Contract labor. This is what the dentist was paying this is what the owner, the seller, was paying the dentist. What we need to do is we need to calculate the real dentist wages. You see, the seller was paying $161,000 under contract labor and $60,000 under officer wages. This is how they tracked what they were paying the dentist. But is that the right number? What we're going to do is we're going to add those numbers back to zero them out, and then we are going to calculate the proper associate wage pay, the associate pay. Even if we're the associate, even if we're the owner, the dentist, to calculate EBITDA, again, we have to understand what would we pay a dentist to do the same dentistry that the seller was doing. And after we see that, we see the associate wages should be $201,000 based on our calculations. So we're going to add that as a cost. We took away what they were paying the dentist. Now we're going to add the right number. And finally, we're going to add a scheduler. Why? Because this seller's wife was working in the office for free as a scheduler. So when the seller sells, we're going to have to hire a scheduler, and that's an additional cost that never showed up in their P&L. So we're going to now add a $53,000 cost. So what happens now when we do this math is all of our changes add up to a net of $177,000. We are going to change what the seller said they were making by 177,000. So we're going to add 177,000 to the seller's number of 18,000. Yeah, by the way, let's look at that. The seller's P&L says they had, they had 672,000, and then they've got what, 18,000 or so of profit, obviously, or net income. Obviously, that's not correct. And so here we go. We add our number to their number, and we end up with $196,000 of net income, or EBITDA in this case, which is a 3.3 multiple at that sale price of $650,000. Is a 3.3 multiple a fair multiple to buy a practice? Absolutely is fair. It's actually highly advantageous for us. So this is a fair price. $650,000 is a fair price. It's 3.3 times our pro forma EBITDA. So again, what is your take-home pay? It's EBITDA plus your associate pay. So in this case, it's the EBITDA we calculated, 196,000, plus what we calculated proper pay was for the dentistry. So we end up having take-home pay of $400,000 in this example. This is an incredible practice to purchase. Now, when we think about a lot of what we're doing here in these acquisitions, there's this common theme of trying to reduce costs. So I want to walk you through different ways we might reduce costs in a practice. This is showing a profit and loss statement. Practice is doing $2 million. I'm not showing you the final take-home pay number in this particular slide, but the take-home pay is actually around $1 million take-home pay. So let's look at this. Everywhere I've highlighted is a potential decision to be made to save money after we acquire a practice. And it's important to understand the business side of dentistry and your ability to make these changes before you start thinking or going to buy a practice. Just like if you were going to someday buy a restaurant, isn't it responsible to first get training and understand how to run restaurants well before you go buy one, right? We need to understand how to run practices well before we go buy one. We need to understand how to control our expenses well in a practice before we then start owning practices, ideally speaking. And so, you might have decisions that help you reduce expenses. You might also choose to practice in a certain way or a certain model that is a lower cost model. And as I go through this, you'll probably see that lower cost does not necessarily mean lower quality. No, these practices typically are super high quality practices, beautiful to walk in, as a patient experience or employees experience is top of the line, and the dentistry good. So we're not going to cut costs with compromise. We're not going to compromise our dentistry to cut a cost. We're not going to compromise the facility to cut a cost. We are going to cut costs in a way that's intelligent. We're going to find ways to do good things at a lower cost. So this example, how do we lower some of these costs? Well, on the front office wages, how do we lower that? How about if we're short-handed a person, we start hiring virtual people at $13 an hour to do all of our insurance verification, process our AOBs, and answer the phone call that we miss. We go to what is now the modern model of dentistry that says we've got rock stars in the practice, but we have kind of lower cost virtual employees that are doing kind of the nitty gritty work behind the scenes. That allows us to continue to grow many times without having to hire more front office people. We instead just send more work virtually at 1/2 to 1/3 the cost, the net cost of having people on site. Hygienists, how do we have a lower cost base with hygiene? Well, we can pay them differently. We could pay them an hourly wage and a commission so that if they don't produce a lot, they don't get paid as much, or if they produce a whole lot, they get paid more. But more specifically, we could go to some sort of assisted hygiene model where for part of the week, or maybe the whole week, our hygiene team is assisted. So I have less hygienists instead of all of them being unassisted and I have to hire more hygienists. That brings us to a lower cost base. And in assisted hygiene, by the way, not only does the company have a lower cost, but the hygienist who's doing it makes more money. And so it's so often a win-win when you do it the right way. With assisted hygiene, if you do it the wrong way, it can become a disaster for the hygienist. And that's why some hygienists really don't like assisted hygiene. They've never experienced it the right way. So if you understand how to do it the right way, you end up with a situation where your cost is lower and you retain your hygienist better because they're paid more than everyone else. If we go down to aligner fees, this particular example has $35,000 of aligner fees. And, how do we lower that? Maybe you're using a certain well-known company and you switch companies and you have a lower fee, or maybe you invest in getting training on 3D printing. You buy a printer, you use open source software or service, and now you're able to make aligners that give you the clinical result you want at just a fraction of the cost. How many years owning this practice will you work and spend 35 grand every year until you decide to take a little bit of time and make it a priority to switch to a printed model instead of a service model like you're doing? That would be a way to cut costs. Supplies need to be under 4%, which includes office supplies. Labs need to be under 5%. That is about budgeting. I could go on and on about that, but things we teach. But you can easily get supplies under 4% in every single practice I've ever seen. Rarely would you have to pick new brands of gloves or bonding agent. Rarely would you have to make changes like that. Almost always does it come down to enforcing a budget. Just like if you had a budget of going out every week, you'd go out some, but you wouldn't go out too much. If you had a budget of, a food budget when you go to the grocery store, you'd buy what you need, you'd buy the right thing, and you wouldn't go waste money on stuff you'd ultimately throw away. Implementing a budget with supplies has a similar effect. You end up spending a lot less money, but you still have everything you need. Marketing is usually a big opportunity to save money if you use the right marketing company. They're able to kind of do things at a lower cost per click, for example. I already told you who we use, dentalmarketing.com, but that is a great thing to change a practice to after you acquire it, is switch to a kind of a higher efficiency marketing company that uses technology and AI to get your costs down, yet your performance is awesome. Merchant fees, this practice already implemented a patient pay method, but you can go to a patient pay method for merchant fees and not skip a beat. And so those are all kind of ways to reduce the cost. Why do I bring this up? The more you know about your ability to reduce cost, the more advantageous your pro forma financial analysis becomes. You see, the better you are at knowing how to reduce costs, the more practices you could buy, because suddenly that purchase price isn't too high for you. It might be for someone else that doesn't know how to run the business with good efficiency. But if you know how to run the business with good efficiency, you'll be able to make the tweaks you need to make to achieve the EBITDA that you need to achieve to justify buying that practice at that purchase price. So, if I were, I've got 5 kids. If one of my kids wanted to be a dentist, I would have them go through business training as early as possible in their career, preferably while they're a dental student, and then go through it again regularly. And that business training would be about how to run a practice, how to start a practice, and how to acquire a practice. And with that knowledge, you become very confident in not just feeling good about what to do, but really the big change is when you gain knowledge and this confidence, you end up doing something. What I mean by that is so often we dentists, we get stuck, trapped in mediocrity, working for someone else or just accepting our situation. And we can go years, decade in that same situation. But if we had just had the knowledge to then give us the confidence, we would have changed. We wouldn't have waited another 8 years to change. So that's actually, to me, one of the biggest costs we see in dentistry is the loss we get when we don't move sooner. We've lost the future we could have had because we just didn't prioritize our own knowledge. We didn't prioritize time and analyzing what's out there. So we just keep going month after month after month, doing the same thing and maybe even complaining about it, working for someone else's practice, someone else's equipment, someone else's team, someone else's systems. And they're taking part of the money and we get the leftover money and like, that's our career. So that's the big loss I see in the industry, the big kind of trap. So anyway, back to this, the better you are at understanding how to control costs, the more confident you can be in going into an acquisition. Also, of course, a distressed acquisition, you're going to have to cut costs. Part of course, owning a practice isn't just cutting costs. Obviously, we have to try to grow and be more successful. And that's what everyone seems to talk about in dentistry. More new patients, bigger cases, full arch. They talk about all this growth. But the reality is that growth has a lot of different drivers in it as well, a lot of different ingredients. I'm sure most of y'all have seen some of my other webinars where I start talking about some of those drivers, all the different components, ingredients of patient flow and of diagnosis and of case acceptance and verbiage and, systems, things like that. If you haven't seen those webinars, we have webinars from time to time. You should stay connected and attend some of that stuff. But that's also, of course, part of your ability to acquire a practice and then become successful is your understanding of the moving parts of your day-to-day that, in essence, create collections, right? The day-to-day, the case acceptance, things like that create collections, and then you spend it on expenses. So you need to learn to not spend as much. And then what you're left with is take-home pay and EBITDA. And I would like to see you be at $1 million or more take-home pay as a solo dentist. That's what we coach people. That's our first kind of benchmark. And that is very doable because it's very reasonable to have 2 million in collections for a solo dentist. Very reasonable. And if you have 2 million in collections and you've done it thoughtfully, you're taking home half of that. That's very reasonable. That's a dentist that's doing about 5,500 a day in production with an average hygiene department. You'll get to about 2 million in collections. So, as we kind of think now through to the topic of this webinar, acquisitions, the practices in front of you to analyze the financials of, are they going to be your best bet to get to 2 million collections, 1 million take-home pay? That's a bigger question. We focused on the question before that. Is this sale price a fair price, and how much money will I make if I own it, right? What kind of changes might I have to make on the pro forma that say, yes, I should own this thing. It is a good acquisition. But a bigger conversation would be, okay, if it is an okay acquisition, is it though the thing that's going to get me to 1 million take-home pay within the next 3 or 4 years? And if it's not, or if you're not sure, if you feel kind of uncertain about that, then you probably need to analyze the area for a startup, because a startup has a lot of kind of benefits over an acquisition. And hitting that financial number is, in my opinion, a lot more straightforward when you get to pick a great area and you get to build a great practice and you get to do it right from the beginning. Also, another thing to kind of comment about, acquisitions and startups. In a startup, you pay once. You build it up front. You pay once with one loan. Acquisition, you pay twice. You pay to buy it, but then over the next 5 years, you're going to start paying more to fix it, to paint it, to re-equip it, to re-software it, to replace the team. Like all those expenses kind of have this secondary cost with associated stresses. And what do you end up with at the end of the day? Practice that might be in the wrong location, might not be the exact size you wanted, definitely not like what you envision to represent your personality and your dentistry. And ultimately, you might have to pay a third time to move it to your final destination, the final practice location you wanted, what really does represent what you want to stand for. So keep that in mind as well. I hope that makes sense to everyone. If you're unsure of what I'm saying, it just comes from the fact that you haven't gotten a full set of like training. You don't speak the language yet, and you don't know where to put your like belief and certainty yet, just because you're inexperienced still on the business side of this, on the business side of dentistry. So what I'm going to do now is I'm first going to let you know that we have an offer for you if you do want to get some training. And then I'm going to go and dive into all the questions I can to answer the whole list of questions y'all have provided. And please type in more questions if you have more questions. By the way, if I don't get to your question, we will be answering them after the fact. I got 5 kids. I can't stay here forever. I got to go kiss them goodnight. If I can't get to your question, we will be reaching out to you and try to answer all the questions we didn't answer. And you can also, by the way, always get a hold of me. Look at the slide right now. On the slide, that's my personal Instagram. Like no one runs that for me. There's not some social media manager like responding. That's me. That's my family, my friends, my life, me. So if you ever want to talk to me or send me a message or get a hold of me, please, that's one easy way to do it. Just connect with me on Instagram, send me a private message. I get messages every day, and I almost always respond within, 1 day or less. So that's an easy way to get a hold of me if you want to get a hold of me. Okay, the offer that we want to give you for being part of this webinar, obviously it benefits us, and we think it really freaking benefits you, is we've got these 4 very intense training events. They're 2 days long, 16 hours, like 400 pages of content. I believe with all of me that they are the very best business training opportunities in dentistry. And our reviews are through the roof. And practically every podcaster out there in dentistry, almost every success story I know of has been through our training at some point. So I encourage you to look at this. If you use that code, it's not going to be available forever, but if you use that code, 25% off. Our events are not cheap, so that's a significant savings. That'll probably cover your flight and hotel. And really ask yourself, is this next year or 2 of your career the time to start a new chapter and do a new thing, to kind of elevate to the next thing? Are you wanting that? You may not ever feel ready, but are you wanting it? Are you going to take some steps forward? If so, I assure you that this is a very smart thing to do, is to go to one of these events that makes sense for you and to get inundated with training on business. 16 hours of the kinds of stuff that you've heard today on the webinar. Okay. You can also go to our website there. So let's go into some questions. All right. So I'm going to try my best to answer as many as possible. All right. What if a healthy acquisition occurs, but then a quarter of the production came from specialty treatment that you don't currently deliver, like all on X? All right. So the question is asking, you've analyzed the practice and financially it'd be a healthy acquisition. However, a fourth of the collections are coming from something you don't even do, all on X. Well, I'll answer it in 3 ways, and I bet you can predict my answer. Number 1 is you need to analyze this thing without those collections or the associated expenses with it. So find out how much all on X is in collections and how much it is on expenses, and go run a pro forma without it, so that you understand worst case scenario, this is what the financials look like. Next, consider bringing someone in to do the treatment, but know that you're probably going to do less cases with an outsider coming in than when it was the owner doing it. So you're going to have to kind of estimate less than what the owner was doing and then see what the financials look like. Or third, let this be the universe telling you that maybe it's time for you to go learn how to do it, because you are buying a practice that has a foundation of getting it done. You are in a demographic, in a patient base, in the part of a city where all on X is a reality, and it could be your reality if you just go invest time and money into the training for it. So that's how I would handle that situation. All right, next thing. The office I'm currently looking at is doing okay. It's not healthy, but it doesn't seem to be distressed either. Should I look for a blend of disruption and protection in that case? Okay, good question. So the office is doing okay. What does that mean? To me, healthy is I can pay the debt payments and I'm making more money with what's left over than what I was making as an associate. So if I buy the thing after I pay my debt, I got more money than if I didn't buy the thing. Okay, that's healthy. If we're not there, we're not healthy. And so I either need to, it's either kind of distressed in this definition of my take-home pay, and it may not even look that distressed, but I'm going to have to make changes. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense for me to buy something only to take on all the stress of ownership, maybe, and the risk of debt, and then make less money. All right. So what should we do if it's on that borderline? It's kind of like barely there. You know, should we do a blend of disruption or protection? No, I'd say that go in with conservative view about disrupting the practice. So if it's not in a situation where you'd be losing to buy it, but you just be kind of neutral, then give it time. Go in without disruption because you need the practice to educate you on what's actually happening. Let me say it another way. That profit and loss statement isn't completely accurate. It doesn't completely represent what's actually happening. That seller could be having surprises around the corner that you don't know about yet until you own it. And by the time you buy it, you may have the employees react differently to you. You might have the patient base react differently to you. So there's these kind of components of risk that you're unaware of. If this practice is not losing on day one, then you want to be very conservative about changing anything because you need to give yourself time to understand, what all is actually happening in this practice and what is causing the success. So I'd still stay very low disruption until I got a sense of what's happening. And then I would go in and start disrupting things after that. Okay. Next question. I have had conversations with DSOs and they won't look at an office for sale if the revenue is less than $800,000. Is that true? Obviously, it depends on the EBITDA. Yeah, a general rule of thumb is many DSOs won't buy a practice if it's collecting less than 800 grand. But also another rule of thumb is if a practice is collecting less than 800 grand, many times it does not have good EBITDA. It does not have good profitability. It is got higher risk for anyone that buys it, whether it's the DSO or a private dentist. So, offices that collect less than 800, could take a whole lot of effort from the DSO's perspective to grow. If they put that same effort into bigger practices, they'd grow a lot more dollars out of those efforts. And so many DSOs just have as a model that we're not going to go into struggling practices. And that is one way they define a practice as struggling. Next question, could you go briefly on the best systems for assisted hygiene? Oh, geez, Jonathan, there's no brief about that. And this isn't the topic for it. But in essence, assisted hygiene is where a hygienist is covering 2 ops and they're not having to rush, but they're also never stopping. They're going one op to the next, and in front of them is an assistant that's rushing at times to get everything ready and then waiting on them at times. So the hygienist is kind of doing this slow, easy jog through their whole day, through their whole schedule, while someone is ahead of them getting everything ready and then waiting, and then ahead of them getting everything ready and then waiting. And what you do is you outline all the tasks that have to be done in this hygiene appointment, and you're going to assign most of the tasks to the assistant in the right order. And then the hygienist is going to get the tasks of communicating to patients for case acceptance and education, and of course, performing the treatment. And there's a specific way to schedule that so that you're not double booking the hygienist and you're not creating inefficiencies either. And there's a specific way to pay hygienists so that they're incentivized, they're paid more if they were to do assisted hygiene in that way. The end result is you rarely run behind, the hygienist isn't worn out, the hygienist is paid more, and the business has a lower cost. And that is what we try to accomplish with assisted hygiene. All right, let's continue here. How do you look at the provided P&L from the selling doctor to know if it's even worth hiring an accountant to do a proper pro forma? All right, Kyle. This is going to be one of the biggest financial decisions you make in your career over the next 10 years. This is that time in your life where you hire people, even if you don't know if you need them that much or if they're going to bring a lot of value to you that much. You're going to hire them because there's a whole lot you don't know that you don't know. So when you are looking at practices and you're seriously considering a couple practices, you are going to hire an accountant to go in and to look through the P&L. The accountant's probably going to ask for access to the actual QuickBooks file to look at the ledgers, and the accountant may readjust the P&L, highlight red flags, inaccuracies, things that were coded incorrectly, and spend a lot of time helping you understand what a pro forma P&L would look like. The exercise I did with you on this webinar, you should have an accountant doing with you. And otherwise, you are at high risk of getting, unfortunately, screwed by a surprise you didn't see coming. This is the time in your life to hire someone like that. Okay. Next question. What seminar do you recommend for someone looking to acquire a practice? For sure, the Practice Management Mastery course. It is not a seminar about buying a practice. It is a seminar about how to run a practice. Anyone that is thinking about being an owner, that's your first course. Now, in addition to that, if you're looking to buy a practice, it might sound a little odd, but our multi-practice seminar teaches our process of doing acquisitions and mergers and gives you a very good overview of how to do startups. Of course, it's a room of people wanting to have lots of locations. And so we talk about all of this in the context of lots of locations. But those two seminars would probably fill you completely with the information you need to know to buy and then run a super successful practice. Most people, however, come to us and they'll go to two seminars first, the startup seminar and the practice management seminar, most people. But if you know you're going to be doing an acquisition, it might be best for you to obviously not go to the startup course, but to go to the multi-practice and the practice management course. The practice management one being the most valuable to you, although they're both super valuable, but that's like the big course that everyone has to go to. Teaches you how to be a great operator of a practice. All right, next question. If you buy a fee-for-service office, should you accept insurance to attract new patients, or should you keep it as fee-for-service? In general, you should keep it as fee-for-service, and you should focus more on marketing better and answering phones and converting better to grow your patient flow, and also reappointing patients better. In general, that's what you should do, because when you go in network, if you were fee for service, all those existing Cigna patients you're already getting full fee from now get reduced. You take a huge financial hit. And that financial hit is typically way more costly than investing into a bigger marketing campaign and phones training and conversion training. So almost always you would stay out of network. You'd stay fee for service, and you would have a different strategy for growth. And by the way, growth doesn't just come from more patients. Growth comes from more diagnosis and more case acceptance. And more diagnosis and more case acceptance is relatively straightforward to do once you've kind of been trained and understand all the components and ingredients of that. So like if I were buying a fee-for-service practice that didn't have a lot of new patients, I'd invest heavily into marketing and phones, heavily. And I would spend time mastering diagnosis and case acceptance. And I will have probably high growth without going in network with anyone. So my margin, my profit margin stays high, stays true and healthy. I'm not cutting that down. I'm not getting a Ruth's Chris steakhouse and turning it into some fast food joint just because I want more volume. I'm just learning how to market my Ruth's Chris steakhouse better and see if people can buy dessert more often. That's how I'm going to have growth. I hope that makes sense. Next question. No, that's it for now. Awesome. Those are the last. Oh, hold on. No, we got more questions. Knowing that the goal is to get 1 million take-home pay, what size of practice in terms of collections would we be looking at ideally, and how many ops? This is a very good question. If you don't know how good that it is, it's because you haven't been fully trained yet. But 1 million in take-home pay obviously can happen with a practice as small as, let's call it 2 million in collections, assuming that that's the owner operator dentist. That would be very reasonable, but a lot of practices are not set up that way. They're overstaffed, big facilities, big fixed costs. They're low fees. They're trying to drive volume. They don't have good case acceptance. They don't do any sort of specialty procedures whatsoever. And so they struggle to get to 2 million, let alone take home half of that. But if you were to build a startup practice the right way, and you were to manage that relatively well, not Superman or anything, but you're going to manage it relatively well, that would probably be a 5 operatory practice that would get to 2 million in collections by year 3. And half of that would be take-home pay. Now, the opposite of that, the opposite of a startup practice would be like, the opposite of a single practice with an owner dentist would be multiple practices where the owner doesn't pick up a handpiece. That's like the opposite model, right? And to get $1 million take-home pay in that model of not picking up a handpiece and having multiple locations, you're going to be around 5.5 million in collections as an organization. That's going to be 5 or 6 associates. It's going to be 6 to 9 hygienists. Mediocre production, $40,000 to $50,000 a month for the hygienist, for the dentist. Typical production per day for the hygienist. You're going to end up at 5.5 million collections, 1 million take-home pay. That represents about an 18% margin. That's if you don't pick up a handpiece. If you pick up a handpiece part of the time and you have associates, most dentists make way less money. But if you don't do what most dentists do, and you instead build what I've trained people as a virtual practice on top of your regular practice, you can have $1 million take-home pay working 1 day a week in a practice with 2 associates. So that might be a 7-op practice with extended hours, or maybe a 10-op practice, or maybe 2 locations. You're working 1 day a week clinically, and you could get to $1 million take-home pay. So my answer to you is not very clear, because there's so many different ways to get to $1 million take-home pay. But I think you were asking about the first thing. If I'm the owner operator dentist, how many ops do I typically need? 5 ops, 2 million in collections, owner operator dentist, 50% overhead, or less overhead than that. You're going to be at $1 million take-home pay. And that could happen, by year 3 for a typical startup that builds out in our model. Okay, guys, we're way over time. I've got to stop answering the questions, and I apologize for those that I couldn't get to, but I encourage you to reach out to us anyway. I've got a few last things to say. If you get anything from this webinar, get this one thing. If this short bit of time on some online webinar with just a handful of slides and a dude in a sweater made you see dentistry differently or gave you knowledge, that's the universe telling you, number 1, you need to get more knowledge. And number 2, you're probably late to doing the next thing that you should do for yourself in your career. So it's never going to feel right, like the perfect time to do the next thing in your career. You kind of have to have this uncomfortable faith to move forward and say, you know what, I am going to buy a practice. I am going to start a practice. I am going to be an owner. I am going to add more locations. It never felt right to have the next baby. It never felt, it doesn't feel like it's this perfect moment to do it. But what you have to bet on is not, is it the right time? What you have to bet on is the fact that you want to end up there, and you're going to figure it out as you go. Walking forward, showing up to this game is the key. So if you get anything out of this, get the fact that if there was anything that you learned from this little event, it's a sign that you need to know more and you should have already been walking forward somewhere else, but you haven't been, probably because you just haven't had enough of the information to give you the confidence to move forward. And I hope I'm speaking to someone right now. I hope that comment caused someone to say, you know what? I am tired of what we've been doing. I do want the next chapter to start in my life. I am going to start walking forward. I hope that caused someone to do that next right thing. All right. Well, I'm going to end this. I'm going to go kiss my babies goodnight. If you need to get a hold of me, you know how to. I hope I see some of y'all at one of our future events. I really do hope this was worth your time to watch and got you thinking about a lot of things, because so often webinars aren't. We try to make ours valuable. I hope that's what this did for you. Okay. See you next time. Thank y'all so much. Bye-bye.